I am here to actually introduce you to the brilliant Esther Safran Foer, who I first got to know through her son Franklin Foer, who was a writer for The Atlantic and an author published by Penguin Press. I first met Frank when we were college interns 25 years ago at a magazine, and I later ended up editing his first book. He had a meteoric rise to become the editor of the New Republic magazine, and we would often meet for drinks, where he would take pleasure in giving me tips about who the best new writers were at the magazine and which ones might have a book in them. So when I came to Crown 5 years ago, I made a point pretty much right away to go have drinks with him in DC, and he told me about at least 3 new writers who I should keep my eye on. But then he beamed with pride and saved the best for last, saying the book I should really look into was by his mom. All he would say is that she had an amazing story to tell, and he was right. Esther was born in Poland in 1946, right after the war, and is the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. Her parents were the only members of their extended families to survive. Her mother survived, as she says, on the run. Her father was hidden by a local family, but neither of them would ever talk about what happened. Esther would grow up to have a family and a very successful career, but her own family history felt like a bit of a black hole and became kind of an obsession for her. For years, she researched it, looking in archives and databases, and her obsession was in some ways passed on to her 3 sons, Franklin, Jonathan, and Joshua, all of whom developed a certain preoccupation with the idea of memory in their books. So Esther decided to embark on a journey of her own to Ukraine and to Israel and Brazil and back to Washington, D.C., where she was finally able to piece together the fragments of her family's heartbreaking and ultimately heroic story. It's the story of 4 generations who live in the shadow of the Holocaust. They grow up with painful silences and unspeakable tragedy, and in the end, it's what brought them together and turned them into storytellers. And the mother of all storytellers in this family is Esther. She is a force of nature, as you'd have to be able to accomplish and overcome what she has in her life, but she's also the warmest, most generous, dedicated person you'll ever meet, which comes through, I think, on every page of this beautifully written memoir. So we're very lucky to have her here today to talk about her book.
Wow, thank you. Boy, I learned some things there. My son pushed my book. At least one of them did. But that's another story. So my birth certificate says that I was born September 8th, 1946 in Ziegenheim, Germany. None of that is true. It's the wrong date, the wrong city, the wrong country. And it would take me years to understand why my father created this fabrication. Even as a child, and as Tim told you, I was born in Poland, and I'll tell you a little more about that. Even as a child, I understood that there was a lot that I didn't know and couldn't ask about, besides the secret of my invented birthday. As Tim mentioned, I'm the offspring of Holocaust survivors. Both of my parents' entire families were wiped out. By definition, it means I grew up with a tragic and complicated history. I was born in post-war Poland. My parents and I smuggled across the border in a flatbed truck with a false bottom, my mother having to stuff cloth into my mouth to keep me from crying during the most dangerous parts of our border crossing into Germany. This is just as the Iron Curtain is falling, and we're sneaking in right under the Iron Curtain. I'm named for my 2 murdered grandmothers, Esther and Procha. My name was intended to keep the memory of the past alive, but I seem to intuitively understand from the beginning that my role was to bring joy and to point my family towards a brighter future. And in many ways, that's the story of the book, keeping the memory of the past alive while pointing to the future. And for me, that future is the joy of a terrific family born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. My husband and I are the parents of 3 sons, interestingly enough, all best-selling authors, and I hope in your libraries, and the grandparents of 6. We like to say future authors. I spent my professional life in public affairs consulting and in political work, and then helping to create a major new cultural institution inside of a historic synagogue in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, just over Thanksgiving weekend, had for the first time anti-Semitic, had swastikas scribbled on the building, and that's the first time that's happened in Washington. My professional work, was characterized by framing and telling other people's stories. And then for the most important 10 years, when I ran Sixth and I Historic Synagogue, it was about building a new cultural and Jewish institution pointing to the future. And as I thought about it, maybe I had to do those things first to reach a certain point in my life before I was ready to seriously look back at my own family story. The original plan was to write this book with my oldest son, Frank, who Tim knows. Frank at that time was the editor of the New Republic magazine, and he'd accompanied me on the ultimate journey of discovery to Ukraine. But that collaboration didn't happen. Turned out Frank had a book of his own to write. I don't know if it was your book and my literary agent, my wonderful literary agent, very wisely looked at me, even though I've never written anything before, and said, "You need to do this yourself. The book needs to have your own voice." And he was right. I found not only my voice, but I found that the writing process helped me process and understand my family's history, the significance of multi-generational remembering, the importance of storytelling, and the importance of resilience. Most important, however, I was surprised how the process of writing helped me to better understand myself and my place in this story between my remarkable mother and her powerful story, and my father's rescue by non-Jews, and then the stories that were being told by my own sons, who all became storytellers. What happened resulted in this book. Almost 30 years ago, almost by accident, my mother casually mentioned that my father had been in a work detail when his wife and daughter were murdered by the Nazis. So I knew that both sides of my family had been totally murdered by the Nazis, but I didn't know that my father had another family before ours, that he had a wife and a daughter who were murdered, that daughter being my half-sister. Determined to learn more, I scoured Holocaust databases to try to find a birth or death record of my sister. The searches came up totally empty. I talked to everybody that I could think of who might have known, and the response I got was, there were so many people killed, so many babies. How can we remember all of the names? So of the person closest to me killed in the Holocaust, my own sibling, I had not one detail, not a name, not a picture, not one piece of memory to hold on to. And as Tim mentioned, memory's a bit of an obsession in our family. As improbable as it sounds, the youngest of my three sons, Joshua, was the 2006 USA Memory Champion, something that occurred when he was writing his book, Moonwalking with Einstein, The Art and Science of Remembering Everything. He was studying with other memory champions, and he thought, well, maybe I can do this. And he unexpectedly entered the competition and became the memory champion. Frank, my oldest, a journalist and historian, recently spoke on a panel in Kiev. I think that's the way that they're pronouncing it in the impeachment hearings. In Ukraine, our ancestral homeland. The title of his talk was, "Can Memory Save Us from History? Can History Save Us from Memory?" And it wasn't exactly an accident that Jonathan, my middle son, wrote his first novel based on a journey to Europe, to the Ukrainian shtetl of Trochenbrod, where we believed my father had come from. Before he left that summer of 1998, I gave him copies of a photograph of my father with three other people, an older man and two women, the people my mother thought had hidden my father in their home during some period of the war. The hope was that Jonathan might find the family that gave my father shelter. Well, I don't know how many of you read Everything is Illuminated, but he found nothing. And probably a good thing, because lacking facts, he spent the rest of the summer writing a work of fiction based loosely on a few details he knew about our family history. That book, of course, became an international bestseller, and it was followed by a film. The good news, besides that it became a bestseller, was that it sparked new interest in the shtetls our family came from. and it opened the doors for new information. People from all over the world started contacting me and telling me that Jonathan got it all wrong. And here's what the facts really were. The curious facts, and this is I can say this to a room of librarians, is that one book birthed another book. That Jonathan's fiction strangely opened the door to the real story. Fiction led to fact. A work of fiction became the missing link in piecing together our family story. Because of his book, I met, as Tim said, people around the world. One was a woman in Israel who I met in the middle of the night when somebody had called her and she said she knew something. She knew my father before the war. She knew his wife and gave me her name, Zipporah. She knew where they actually lived, which wasn't Trockenbrod where Jonathan went. But but she couldn't remember a baby. And my search also took me to libraries. For those of you who may not have been there, the Library of Congress has the most amazing map room, or it's virtually a whole building. And I spent 2 days there. Because the names of these shtetls changed, these little villages changed depending on who occupied them, I got the latitudes and the longitudes, and I spent these 2 days at the library finding maybe hundreds of maps, historic maps, Nazi maps, some magnified to the point where you were able to see the individual houses in these villages. And then the New York Public Library, much to my surprise, has almost 700 Yisker and memorial books documenting Jewish communities destroyed in the Holocaust. And I was even able to order, on print by demand, one of those books for my own library. So I make connections everywhere, and it's just the way my mind works. And one of the most amazing things is when I saw this list of speakers, I saw Robert Kolker. My family comes from Kolk, and I immediately said, you must come from Kolk. We're probably related. And he does. So the message, look everywhere. You'll never know what you're going to find. I even did DNA research and found a second cousin, and that's another amazing story. And then I understood after all this research that I had to go to Ukraine myself. I had to see what I could find. I found a young woman who was a researcher in Ukraine. I sent her a copy of the picture of the family that we thought hid my father and the name of the shtetl that I now knew he lived in. She went there, she passed a copy of the photo around the village, and almost immediately someone recognized my father and said his name. That's Label. And she said, and he's with David, who saved him during the war. What's more, the rescuer's grandson still lived in the village, and the house had old photos of the family, which my researcher photographed and emailed to me. She thought she had made an absolute match. I wasn't so sure. After all these years, I was still skeptical. So I hired, of all things, a former FBI photographic forensic expert. We spent an hour together, which cost me $250. And he said at the end, I can't tell you it's them, but I also can't tell you that it's not them. What he did give me were clues of what to look for when I went to Ukraine. He said, look at the clothes. These are not people with huge wardrobes. And when they had their picture taken, they probably wore the same clothes. So in August 2009, my oldest son, Frank, and I boarded a Lufthansa flight to Lvov, Ukraine. Our guide met us at the airport. Frank immediately asked her what she thought. Was this really them? And she said, I'm 90% certain. And he said, why only 90%? And she said, because the last 10% is up to you. We nervously drove to the village for a meeting with the family. While only one brother still lives there, 5 members of the family came to meet us. And it wasn't exactly easy because the village it takes 4 hours to walk from the nearest bus stop. That's how remote it was. They all stood outside as we walked up. Frank and I were just full of emotion. And we came up to them and we just hugged them warmly. I'm not sure they knew where this was going. We went inside the wooden house, which still today has no indoor plumbing. Photographs of the family lined the front room. Nadia, the family matriarch, pointed out that her grandfather always wore an unusual shirt, one with a high collar and 2 buttons, that her grandmother had to make for him. Bingo, that was the shirt in my photograph. So I leaned over to Frank and I said, "You think it's really them?" And he said, 110%. While we were telling stories and poring over pictures, an old woman who lived down the street came in. I mean, this is a tiny village, and she just wandered in to see what was going on and who these strangers were. She got right into the conversation. She picked up my picture, and she immediately identified Label, my father. She remembers after the war when he came out of the house from hiding. She was filled with revelations. She remembered his wife, Zipporah. Finally, we worked up the courage to ask the old woman if she remembers that Label and Zipporah had a child, a baby. And she says without hesitation, "Of course, I played with her, but she wasn't a baby. She was 5 or 6 years old. She had long black hair, and she liked to play with a ball." Then she looked right at me, and she said, "Your sister's name was Asya." On April 29th, 2017, my youngest granddaughter was born. Her parents named her B. Asya Foer in memory of my half-sister. By coincidence, or maybe not by coincidence, she was born on the weekend between Yom HaShoah, the day that commemorates the Holocaust, and Yom HaAtzmaut, the day that celebrates the birth of the modern state of Israel. That is to say, she was born between a commemoration of the tragedy of the past and the promise of the future. And hence the title, "I Want You to Know We're Still Here." Thank you.